If I step into that bathroom with you, everything changes, Ava Johnson heard Daniel Carter say in a voice so calm it felt like a command rather than a request, standing in the center of the marble hallway of his Los Angeles estate where silence always seemed to carry more weight than sound. Ava froze with a stack of folded towels in her hands, unsure if she had misheard the most dangerous man in the city, Daniel Carter, a man known for controlling entire networks of influence without ever raising his voice, yet now he stood there slightly pale, his sleeve rolled up revealing a bandage stain from a recent encounter he refused to explain. The kind of silence that followed him into every room made the air feel heavier as he continued, I don't trust anyone else in this house right now, Ava, only you. Ava's throat tightened because in 6 months of working here she had mastered invisibility, keeping her eyes low, her words fewer, surviving by becoming part of the background, but nothing about this moment allowed invisibility. Victor Hale, watching from the far end of the corridor, shifted uneasily as if he wanted to object but didn't dare. Daniel turned toward the private bathroom door at the end of the hall and spoke again, not harshly but with an unsettling calm, I need to clean this properly, and I need someone who won't lie to me about what they see. Ava hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to step back, to disappear the way she always did when power moved too close, but something in his tone was different tonight. Not dominance but exhaustion, like a man holding together too many fractured pieces at once. Slowly she followed him into the bathroom where warm light reflected off polished stone and water already filled the deep soaking tub, steam rising gently into the air. Daniel leaned on the counter for a moment as if the weight of the world had narrowed to a single point in his shoulders. You don't have to be afraid, he said without looking at her. And that was the first time anyone in this house had ever acknowledged fear as something real instead of weakness. Ava placed the towels down carefully and nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm not afraid of you, sir, just of what I don't understand. Daniel gave a faint exhale that might have been almost a laugh but carried no humor. Good, because I don't understand it either anymore. The silence between them stretched, not threatening but fragile, like something balancing on the edge of breaking or becoming something else entirely. Ava stepped closer as instructed, careful and controlled, noticing for the first time how human he looked when the weight of authority wasn't fully holding him upright. The city outside these walls could have been a different world entirely, and yet here in this quiet room every rule she had ever learned about distance and survival began to blur. Daniel lowered himself near the edge of the bath with deliberate restraint, pausing as if even this simple act required negotiation with himself. Ava stayed where she was, hands folded, waiting for instructions that never came immediately. Instead he spoke in a lower voice, I was told I can't afford mistakes anymore, not in business, not in loyalty, not even in trust. Ava listened without interrupting, sensing that for the first time she wasn't being seen as staff but as something closer to a witness. Daniel finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable but no longer cold, just tired in a way that power could not hide. Stay if you want, leave if you must, but don't pretend you didn't see this. Ava nodded again, slowly, realizing that whatever began in this bathroom was no longer about orders or rules, but about a man who had forgotten what it meant to let someone stay without fearing what they might take from him. And in that fragile quiet she understood that stepping closer had already changed everything, even if neither of them were ready to admit it yet. The silence that followed felt heavier than water itself as Ava Johnson stood near the edge of the marble bathroom, listening to the soft mechanical sound of running water filling the large soaking tub while Daniel Carter remained seated on the counter with his sleeves rolled up, staring at nothing in particular, as if the entire world beyond that room had temporarily lost meaning. For a few seconds neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city filtered through thick glass windows that kept Los Angeles feeling like a separate reality. Then Daniel finally broke the silence without looking at her. You can leave if you want to, but if you stay I need you to understand something. Ava kept her posture steady even though her chest felt tight with uncertainty. She had learned over the years that men like him did not make simple requests. Everything carried weight, everything came with consequence. She responded carefully, I understand that I am only here to assist, nothing more. Daniel gave a faint nod but did not correct her. Instead he slowly lowered his gaze to his hands as if measuring his own thoughts before speaking again. This house has too many eyes and too many expectations. People see what they want to see and report what benefits them. Ava did not respond, she already knew that truth. In a place like this silence was often safer than honesty. Victor Hale remained outside the doorway, but his presence could still be felt like a warning that never needed words. Daniel finally shifted his position and reached for a small first aid kit placed near the sink, opening it with controlled movements that suggested familiarity with discomfort rather than fear of it. "I had a meeting earlier today that did not go as planned," he said quietly, "and I do not know yet who decided it should end that way." Ava's eyes lowered slightly, not because she was guilty of anything, but because she understood what kind of world this was, where trust was fragile and suspicion was currency. She stepped closer only because he motioned slightly with his hand, not commanding but inviting in a restrained way that felt unfamiliar coming from him. As she carefully prepared a clean cloth from the folded stack she had brought, Daniel watched her briefly, then spoke again. "You have worked here long enough to see things others ignore." Ava paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "I see what I am allowed to see, sir." Daniel's expression tightened slightly at her answer, as if it confirmed something he already feared. "Allowed," he repeated softly, as if the word itself carried irony. Then he leaned back slightly and continued, "I want to change that assumption." Ava did not respond immediately because change in this house never meant something simple. It always meant shifting rules that someone else had already written. She carefully dampened the cloth and moved closer to clean the edge of his forearm where the bandage had been slightly loosened. Her movements were precise and cautious, not because she was afraid of him but because she understood the importance of control in spaces like this. Daniel remained still as she worked, his voice lowering again. "I do not expect trust from anyone, not in my position, but I expect honesty from those who choose to remain close enough to see the truth." Ava's hands paused briefly before continuing, her voice steady but quiet. "I have no reason to lie." Daniel finally looked at her fully then, his eyes carrying a kind of exhaustion that did not match the image of power people outside this house imagined. For a moment the distance between authority and vulnerability seemed thinner than it should have been, and then he said, "Good, because starting today I am not asking you to be invisible anymore." And the words lingered in the air between them like the beginning of something neither of them had agreed to but both of them could no longer avoid. The words Daniel Carter had spoken lingered in the air long after the sound of running water had softened into a steady background rhythm, and Ava Johnson found herself standing a little more still than before, as if the room itself had shifted into a different temperature where silence was no longer a way to disappear but a way to be seen. Daniel remained seated on the edge of the marble counter, his posture controlled yet slightly less rigid than when she had first entered, as though admitting even a small change in routine required effort from someone used to controlling every outcome in his environment. He adjusted the sleeve on his forearm carefully, not because he was concerned about appearance, but because he seemed focused on maintaining composure in a space where he no longer fully trusted his own thoughts. Ava continued her task with quiet precision, folding a clean towel and placing it within reach without being asked, and for the first time she noticed something unusual about the atmosphere. It was not fear that filled the room, but uncertainty. Daniel finally spoke again without raising his voice, the kind of tone that made every word feel intentional. "Tomorrow morning there will be people coming here who will expect explanations I am not ready to give." Ava paused briefly but did not interrupt. She understood the unspoken rule of listening in houses like this. Daniel continued, "You will not be asked to lie, but you may be asked to observe, and if you are asked anything you will answer only what you have seen with your own eyes, nothing more." Ava nodded once, her expression calm even though the responsibility behind those words was heavier than anything she had been given before in this house. Victor Hale's presence outside the doorway shifted slightly, as if he had heard enough to become more alert. But he still did not enter. Daniel stood slowly from the counter and walked a few steps toward the sink, turning on the water briefly before turning it off again, a small repetitive gesture that suggested his thoughts were not fully anchored. He glanced at his reflection in the polished surface above the sink and then spoke as if addressing both Ava and himself at the same time. "People in my position do not get the luxury of uncertainty. Everything is either a threat or a strategy." Ava listened without reacting, but something in his tone suggested he was not fully convinced by his own words anymore. He turned slightly toward her, his gaze steadier now, and added, "But tonight I am not certain which one you are." Ava felt a slight tension in her chest at the honesty of the statement, not because it offended her, but because it revealed how little trust existed in his world. She answered carefully, "I am not a threat, sir. I am only doing my job." Daniel studied her for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That may be true," he said quietly, "but truth is not always what people choose to believe." A brief silence followed, during which the distant sound of traffic outside the estate reminded them that the world beyond these walls continued unchanged. Daniel finally moved toward the door but stopped just before exiting, turning slightly back toward her. "Tomorrow you will see things you were not trained for, Ava Johnson, and when that happens you will decide whether you remain invisible or whether you remain here." The statement was not framed as a warning but as a turning point. And as he left the room leaving only the softened sound of water and distant city noise, Ava stood alone in the marble space, realizing that nothing about her role in this house would remain the same after that night. The next morning arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the entire estate before the sun had fully risen, and Ava Johnson found herself waking earlier than usual, not because she was required to, but because something about Daniel Carter's words from the previous night refused to leave her thoughts. The idea that she would no longer be expected to remain invisible carried a weight she had not yet learned how to hold. Downstairs the kitchen staff moved with their usual precision, unaware of the subtle shift that had already begun inside the house, but Ava noticed it in small details: the way security personnel walked with slightly more urgency, the way Victor Hale spoke into his phone with shorter, more controlled sentences, and the way the atmosphere felt less like routine and more like anticipation. When she entered the main hallway she saw Daniel already awake. Standing near the large windows that overlooked the city, dressed in a simple dark shirt without a jacket, his posture straight but not rigid, as if he had not fully decided how much control he wanted to exert over the day ahead, he turned slightly when he heard her approach, acknowledging her presence with a brief nod that felt different from anything he had done before. Not an order, not an evaluation, just recognition. Ava stopped at a respectful distance, unsure whether to speak, but Daniel broke the silence first. "They will arrive in less than 1 hour, he said calmly, "and I want you to stay where you can see everything but not be drawn into anything." Ava nodded once, understanding that observation was now part of her responsibility. Victor appeared moments later at the far end of the hallway, carrying a slim folder and speaking in a low voice. "There are confirmations from both sides of the city. Everything is aligned for the meeting." Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead he kept his gaze on the city beyond the glass as if measuring something invisible. Then he finally said, "Alignment does not mean safety, Victor. It only means timing." The words carried a weight that made Victor pause before replying. Ava remained silent, but she felt the subtle shift in the room as if the air itself had tightened. When the guests arrived the estate transformed into something more formal. Voices became lower, movements became more deliberate, and Ava was positioned near the edge of the main dining hall where she could observe without interfering. She noticed immediately that every person who entered carried themselves with practiced confidence, but none of them looked at Daniel with ease. They looked at him with calculation, as if every word spoken in his presence had consequences that extended far beyond the room. Daniel greeted each of them with controlled restraint, offering nothing unnecessary, only what was required to maintain authority without revealing vulnerability. Ava observed carefully, remembering his instruction to see only what was real, not what was assumed. During the early part of the meeting the conversation remained structured and formal, but beneath it she could sense tension building in small pauses, exchanged glances, and carefully chosen words that carried double meaning. Victor stood slightly behind Daniel, monitoring every interaction with quiet precision. Ava's attention shifted briefly to Daniel's face, noticing that despite his calm exterior there was something different in his focus, not detachment, but awareness sharpened to a point where nothing in the room was overlooked. As the discussion continued, one of the guests made a comment that caused a brief silence, not hostile but loaded with implication, and Ava saw Daniel's expression change only slightly, enough for those paying attention to recognize that the balance of the room had shifted. He placed his glass down gently and spoke in a measured tone, reminding everyone that decisions made in uncertainty often revealed more about intention than outcome. The room fell quieter after that, and Ava understood that nothing in this meeting was simply conversation. Everything was positioning, everything was observation. When Daniel briefly looked in her direction she did not look away, and for a moment she realized that her presence was no longer ignored, it was acknowledged, and that acknowledgement carried consequences she had not yet fully understood. As the meeting continued she remained still, watching, listening, realizing that whatever role she held in this house was no longer defined by invisibility, but by something far more uncertain that was beginning to take shape in real time. The room had been quiet for several minutes after Daniel Carter's last statement, yet the silence no longer felt empty, it felt structured, as if every person inside the estate dining hall was now aware that nothing spoken here would remain without consequence. Ava Johnson remained at her position near the edge of the room, hands folded in front of her, carefully observing without drawing attention. but for the first time she understood that observation itself had become a form of participation. Daniel sat at the head of the table with controlled stillness, listening more than speaking, his presence shaping the rhythm of every conversation without the need for raised voice or visible force. Across from him the visiting representatives continued their carefully measured dialogue, but Ava noticed subtle changes in their tone, hesitation where confidence had been, correction where certainty had once existed. Victor Hale stood slightly behind Daniel's right shoulder, scanning the room with quiet precision, his attention shifting between faces, entrances, and exits as though mapping invisible risks. During a brief pause in discussion, Daniel leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table, and spoke in a calm but deliberate tone, reminding everyone that agreements built under pressure rarely survived without clarity of intent. The words were not aggressive, yet they caused a visible shift in posture among the guests. Ava observed how quickly authority could be reinforced without volume or threat, only timing and certainty. One of the visiting men responded cautiously, choosing words that now carried more care than before, while another avoided direct eye contact entirely, focusing instead on the documents in front of him as if they had suddenly become more important than conversation. Ava's attention briefly drifted to Daniel's face. Again, noticing that he was no longer merely listening, he was evaluating, not people in isolation but patterns between them, as if every sentence spoken added another piece to a larger structure only he could fully see. Then without warning a subtle interruption came from the far side of the table, a question phrased politely but with underlying challenge, and the room tightened instantly. Ava saw Victor's hand shift slightly at his side, not reaching for anything, but ready nonetheless. Daniel did not react immediately, which in itself changed the atmosphere more than any response could have. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but the pacing slowed just enough to force attention. He acknowledged the question without accepting its framing, redirecting it back into context that stripped it of implied advantage. The effect was immediate. The tension in the room did not escalate, but it reorganized itself, as if recalibrating around a new center of control. Ava realized then that what she was witnessing was not confrontation but equilibrium being maintained through precision. After a few moments, Daniel shifted his gaze briefly toward her again, not for validation, but for awareness, as though confirming she was still present and still observing correctly. Ava held her posture steady, understanding that her silence was now part of the structure of this moment. As the meeting continued, the energy in the room gradually settled into a controlled flow, no longer tense but also no longer casual. Every statement weighed before being spoken, every response measured before being released, and through it all Ava remained still at the edge of the room, realizing that whatever invisible boundary had once separated her from this world had already begun to dissolve without announcement, leaving her standing in a space where nothing was simple anymore, and everything required awareness beyond instruction. The atmosphere inside the estate had shifted again as the meeting gradually moved toward its final phase, not through resolution but through controlled exhaustion, as if every participant understood that further discussion would only reveal more about their positions than they were willing to expose. Ava Johnson remained at the same position near the edge of the dining hall, her posture unchanged yet her awareness heightened, because what had once felt like background now carried meaning in every small movement. Daniel Carter sat at the head of the table with a stillness that no longer felt purely defensive but increasingly deliberate, as though he had already moved several steps ahead of the conversation taking place in front of him. Victor Hale stood behind him, no longer scanning the room with urgency but with confirmation, as if he had already categorized every presence and outcome into controlled possibilities. Daniel finally spoke again, this time in a tone that softened only slightly but carried more finality than before. He acknowledged the points raised but reframed them in a way that left no space for contradiction without direct confrontation. The effect was immediate. The guests adjusted their tone, some lowering their gaze to documents, others shifting in their seats as if recalculating their approach. Ava observed carefully, realizing that influence in this room was not expressed through dominance alone but through the ability to define the boundaries of conversation itself. A few moments later, one of the visiting representatives attempted to revisit an earlier concern, but Daniel responded with calm precision, redirecting the discussion toward verifiable outcomes rather than speculation, and in doing so, effectively closed the space for further challenge. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after that, no longer tense but structured, as if everyone had accepted an unspoken limit. Ava noticed how even Victor relaxed slightly, though his attention never fully left the environment. Then unexpectedly Daniel stood, signaling a brief pause in proceedings, and the guests followed suit with careful timing, As if synchronizing their movements to avoid appearing uncertain, Daniel stepped away from the table and walked slowly toward the large windows that overlooked the city, and for the first time during the meeting he was not addressing the room but thinking beyond it. Ava remained still, watching as he paused. Near the glass, his reflection blending with the skyline outside, creating an image that felt divided between presence and distance, Victor approached him quietly but did not speak, waiting instead for instruction that did not immediately come. Daniel finally turned slightly, speaking in a lower tone that carried only to those closest, indicating that the next phase of decisions would not be made in this room or under this structure, but elsewhere and under different conditions. The statement was brief, but it altered the energy of the entire gathering, because it implied transition rather than conclusion. Ava understood then that what she had witnessed was not the end of a meeting but the beginning of a shift in control that extended beyond this estate, and as Daniel returned his attention briefly toward her once more, she recognized that her role had moved beyond observation, even if no one had formally acknowledged it. She was now part of what came next, whether she had chosen it or not. As the last of the guests departed, the estate settled into a silence that felt unfamiliar, not because it was peaceful, but because it carried the weight of unanswered questions. Ava Johnson quietly gathered the untouched glasses from the long dining table, moving with the same careful rhythm that had once made her nearly invisible. Yet now every step felt different because she could no longer pretend that she was simply passing through someone else's world. Daniel Carter remained standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the afternoon skyline, his hands resting loosely in his pockets as the fading sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor. Victor Hale approached him only after the heavy front doors had closed behind the final visitor. "Everything ended better than expected," Victor said in a measured voice, but Daniel did not immediately answer. Instead he continued watching the city below as if searching for something beyond the streets themselves. After several quiet seconds he finally replied, "No, it only ended quietly. Those are not the same thing." Victor lowered his head slightly, understanding there was no point challenging the observation. Ava continued collecting the dishes without lifting her eyes, but every word settled into her thoughts. Daniel slowly turned away from the window and looked across the room until his attention rested on Ava. "You noticed something today, did not you?" he asked calmly. Ava stopped for a brief moment before answering honestly. "I noticed that everyone listened to your words, but no one truly relaxed." Daniel gave the faintest hint of approval. "Exactly. They were not listening because they trusted me. They were listening because they were trying to predict me." Ava carefully placed the final glass onto the serving tray before speaking again. "Sometimes people fear what they cannot understand." Daniel allowed himself a quiet smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. "And sometimes they misunderstand what they fear." Victor watched the exchange in complete silence, clearly surprised that Daniel had invited the opinion of someone no one else inside the estate would have considered important enough to ask. After another long pause, Daniel walked toward the dining table where Ava stood, stopping several feet away so there was no sense of intimidation. He looked at the neatly arranged dishes before speaking again. "Everyone in this house has spent years trying to become useful, but you never tried." Ava looked up for the first time, uncertainty crossing her expression. "I only tried to do my work well, sir." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is exactly why I noticed you. People who chase approval often stop seeing what is real, but people who simply do the right thing notice everything." Ava lowered her eyes again, uncomfortable with praise she had never expected to receive. Daniel reached for a folded linen napkin left behind on the table and absent-mindedly smoothed its edges before placing it back exactly where it belonged. "Small things reveal large habits," he said quietly. "Yesterday you organized my study without moving a single document. Today you watched an entire meeting without interrupting a single moment. Most people cannot resist changing something simply because they have the chance. You never did." Ava answered softly, "I was taught to respect what belongs to other people." Daniel met her eyes with a calm expression that carried neither authority nor distance. "Then perhaps that is why I can trust you with things that do not belong to anyone else yet." Victor's expression changed immediately. The sentence was simple, but its meaning reached far beyond the room itself. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken because she understood that trust from someone like Daniel was never given casually. It was earned one quiet decision at a time, and for the first time since she had entered the estate months earlier, she realized that Daniel Carter no longer saw a maid standing before him. He saw someone whose character had become impossible to overlook. The moment Daniel Carter's words settled into the air, the entire estate felt subtly redefined, as if something invisible had shifted in structure rather than sound. and Ava Johnson remained still near the dining table holding the tray of neatly stacked dishes, aware that nothing about her position in the house could be considered ordinary anymore. Victor Hale watched in silence for a few seconds before slowly shifting his weight as if recalibrating how to interpret what he had just heard, but Daniel did not look away from Ava, his attention steady in a way that carried neither pressure nor distance, only certainty. After a brief pause he spoke again in a calm, controlled voice. "Tomorrow there will be another meeting, smaller than today, fewer people, but more precise in what is being decided." Ava nodded slightly, acknowledging the information without interruption. Yet Daniel continued as if the statement was not merely logistical but intentional. "And I want you present in the room." Ava stopped moving for a fraction of a second, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of the tray before she carefully set it down on the nearest table. "I am not part of those discussions," she said softly, not as refusal but as clarification. Daniel responded immediately but without raising his voice. "You were not part of today's either, yet you saw more than most of them did." Victor's eyes shifted briefly toward Ava, now clearly observing her differently than before. Daniel stepped away from the table and walked a few steps closer, maintaining a respectful distance that still carried authority through presence alone. "This is not about position," he said, "it is about perception." Ava looked up fully now, meeting his gaze with cautious attention. Daniel continued, "People in those rooms spend their entire lives trying to control outcomes, but very few of them actually see what is happening while it unfolds." Ava replied carefully, "I only noticed what was in front of me, nothing more." Daniel gave a slight nod as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Exactly, and that is why it matters." Victor finally spoke, his tone measured but firm. "Daniel, this is not an environment where we expand participation lightly." Daniel did not turn toward him immediately, instead keeping his focus on Ava as if the conversation with Victor was secondary to the one unfolding in front of him. "I am not expanding participation," he said calmly. "I am acknowledging capability." The distinction was subtle but absolute, and it caused Victor to fall silent again. Ava felt an unfamiliar tension building, not fear, but awareness that a boundary she had never been invited to cross was being moved without warning. Daniel continued, "You will not be asked to speak unless you choose to, but you will be present, and you will observe everything without filter or instruction." Ava hesitated before responding. "I do not have training for that kind of environment." Daniel's expression remained composed but softened slightly. "Training only teaches you what someone else already understands. I am asking you to rely on what you already know." The room grew quiet again as his words settled, and Ava realized that for the first time since entering the estate she was not being assigned a task but being given recognition. Victor finally exhaled quietly as if accepting that the decision had already been made. Daniel turned slightly toward the window again but did not leave the conversation. Instead he spoke one final sentence with quiet certainty. "Starting tomorrow you will no longer stand at the edge of the room, Ava Johnson, you will stand where things are decided." And as the sunlight shifted across the marble floor, marking the slow passage of time, Ava understood that whatever life she had before entering this estate had already begun to recede behind her, replaced by something she had not yet learned how to name but could no longer avoid. The estate was already quiet when Daniel Carter returned to the main hall later that evening, yet the silence felt different from the one that had filled the house in the morning. It was no longer the silence of observation but the silence of transition, as if something irreversible had already been set in motion and everyone inside the space could feel it without needing confirmation. Ava Johnson stood near the long corridor that led back to the kitchen wing, holding a folded cloth in her hands. Even though her task for the day had already ended, she no longer moved as someone trying to remain unnoticed, but as someone aware that being noticed had become part of her reality. Daniel appeared from the far end of the hallway walking alone, his pace steady but unhurried, and when he reached her he stopped at a respectful distance that no longer carried hierarchy in the same way it once did. Victor Hale was not present, and for the first time the space between them felt unobserved. Daniel spoke first in a low, controlled voice. "Tomorrow's meeting will not resemble today's in structure or expectation." Ava listened carefully without interrupting, and he continued, "There will be fewer voices in the room, but each voice will carry more weight." Ava nodded slightly but remained silent, unsure whether response was required or even appropriate anymore. Daniel studied her for a moment then added, "You will not be asked to decide anything, but you will be expected to understand everything that is being decided." Ava finally spoke, her voice calm but careful. "I am still learning how to interpret situations like this." Daniel gave a faint acknowledgement. then replied, "Most people who are placed in that position never learn at all. The difference is not knowledge, it is attention." A brief pause followed, during which the distant sound of the estate settling for the night echoed through the hallways. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, then asked quietly, "Why me?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her toward the empty corridor, as if considering the weight of the question itself rather than the words. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady but reflective. "Because you did not try to become part of this world, and yet you saw it clearly when you stood near it." Ava absorbed the answer without speaking, feeling the implication more than hearing it. Daniel then reached into his jacket and removed a simple folded document, placing it on the small table beside her without insisting she take it immediately. "This is not a contract," he said calmly. "It is simply context." Ava looked at it but did not touch it. Daniel continued, "You can choose to remain exactly where you are, or you can choose to understand what you have already been observing. Either way, nothing about what you have seen so far will change." Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth she was still holding. The weight of choice felt heavier than any instruction she had ever received in the house. After a long silence, she finally spoke, "If I choose to understand, what changes for me?" Daniel met her eyes directly, and for the first time there was no ambiguity in his expression. "Everything you thought you were outside of will no longer apply, and everything you thought was out of reach will no longer remain distant." Ava remained still as those words settled between them, realizing that the decision she was being offered was not about a task or a role, but about crossing a boundary she had spent her entire life avoiding without ever knowing it existed. The hallway behind them remained quiet, but the sense of finality in the air suggested that whatever direction she chose, nothing inside this estate would ever return to what it had been before that moment.